Hi, so I'm Matt Evans and I'm a PhD student here at Warwick, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Olympic Games, the cultural background of Olympic athletes, and expanding horizons at Olympia. So the ancient Olympic Games were held every 4 years at a site called Olympia, specifically at the Sanctuary of Zeus, which is located here in southern Greece, or in the Peloponnese. And the games were founded in the 8th century BCE, so that's between 2,700 and 2,800 years ago. And these games are inherently linked to religion and the worship of Zeus, among other gods as well. So it was on these ancient games that our current Olympics are roughly based, and many similarities are apparent, such as the fact that they take place every 4 years. They both consist of a mixture of athletic and other competitions, and they also both attract athletes and spectators from far and wide. But there are also many differences. So the ancient games themselves consisted of only a few running events, field events such as discus or javelin, combat events, so boxing, wrestling, and an interesting type of mixture of wrestling and boxing called pankration, as well as horse racing. So there was no cycling, kind of rowing, or volleyball or other kind of modern events at the ancient games. They're quite a simple affair. Also, the ancient games did not take place in different countries or cities every 4 years, as they do today, but were held always at Olympia, though games of equal importance to the Olympics did take place in other Greek cities and sanctuaries. So we know quite a lot about who is participating in the games, thanks to the honours paid to the much celebrated Olympic victors in poetry and inscriptions, as well as the victor lists, which were compiled by historians in antiquity. So these lists are only fragmentary, and of course, by their nature, they only reflect a small proportion of athletes competing in the games. So they only list the victors and not all the athletes taking part. But this does not diminish the historical value in terms of establishing from where Olympic athletes, or at least victors, were coming from to compete in the games. So in this short talk, therefore, we're going to explore the geographical patterns in the catchment area, or the geographical catchment area, of Olympic athletes across the history of the Games. And this will allow us to discuss how the expanding cultural and ethnic horizons of the Olympic Games fits into narratives of Greeks versus others at the sanctuary. So Olympic athletes, or should we say Olympic victors, in the early games up to the 6th century BCE were mostly coming from the city-states of mainland Greece. Particularly prevalent at this time are athletes from Sparta, Elis, and a few from Athens, suggesting that the games were of a more local affair at this time. A few victors, however, especially in the 6th and early 5th century BCE, were coming from the Western Greek cities in Italy and Sicily. So the geographic catchment area is expanding towards the west. One reason for this is that Western tyrants, who are celebrated by the poets Pindar and Bacchylides, were particularly keen to gain victory in the horse races of the Olympics and in other games of mainland Greece as a means of establishing their authority. So the famous charioteer statue at Delphi, which many of you would have probably come across, was dedicated by the Sicilian tyrant of Gela for his chariot race victory at the Pythian Games in Delphi in 470 BCE. Nonetheless, in terms of identity as Greeks versus others, those coming from the Western Greek city-states were still considered Greeks. Shortly after this, however, explicitly non-Greeks gradually became interested in the games, and an example of this is provided by Herodotus. So the historian accounts how the king Alexander I of Macedon tried to participate in the Olympics of around 504 BCE. However, the Greeks who were to run against him, the historian tells us, wanted to bar Alexander from the race, saying that the contest should be for Greeks and not for foreigners. The Macedonian, therefore, was not considered Greek enough to compete in what we have already established were exclusively Greek games around this time. So the only way Alexander was able to compete in the games is by proving himself to be of Argive descent. So that is, he proved that he had ancestors from Argos, which is also in southern Greece. He was then judged to be Greek and competed in the furlong race, and he won joint first place prize. The historicity of Herodotus' account is questioned by modern scholars because there are apparent difficulties in Alexander's actual participation in the games. So it's not entirely certain whether this event actually happened. But to discount this story is to also overlook the underlying point related to how Macedonians were considered non-Greeks in the 5th century BCE, and how the perception of Greeks versus others was of importance to Olympic athletes. So without kind of being able to prove that you were Greek by proving that you had descended from a family of mainland Greece, you weren't able to participate in the Olympic Games, and that came with kind of protests from other athletes, as we've seen here. By the 4th century BCE, however, royal and non-royal Macedonians, as well as athletes from other areas on the fringes of the Greek world, are known to have competed at Olympia. So Philip II, for example, the king of Macedon and father of Alexander the Great, entered successful teams of horses into the Olympics in the middle of the century, while a Macedonian named Clyton won a running race towards the end of the century. The general interest of Macedonian kings in Olympia is highlighted by the building of the Philippeion at the sanctuary. So this is a monumental circular building, or a tholos, which housed the statues of Philip II, Alexander, and other family members. So a major factor in the increased Macedonian participation in the games and interest in the games is the military conquests of Philip II in the 4th century BCE, gaining control of mainland Greece, and this kind of blurred the lines between Greek and Macedonian identity as a result of this shift in political power. Philip's son, so Alexander the Great, who many of you will have already come across, very famous, then significantly kind of expanded the Greek world to the east, as far as modern day Afghanistan, and also to the south, as far as Egypt. As a result of this, the catchment area of Olympic victors significantly expands towards the east, as shown in this chart. So the majority of victors are still coming from the Peloponnese, but there are also victors starting to come from the coast of Turkey, so Asia Minor, and there's even one known from Egypt at this time. So if you look at the yellow and grey lines on this chart here, you can see how victors from the east are gradually increasing in the centuries following Alexander's conquests. So after the second line from the top, we start to see a gradual increase. But the broadening geographic catchment area of Olympic athletes didn't come without cultural tensions arising between kind of Eastern athletes and those from mainland Greece. So the historian Polybius, for example, accounts a boxing match at Olympia towards the end of the 3rd century BCE between Clytomachus from Thebes in mainland Greece and Aristonicus from Alexandria in Egypt. So the Alexandrian was considered an underdog compared to the infamously victorious Theban, and so the crowd, Polybius tells us, offer their support to the Egyptian by cheering by cheering and clapping loudly as he put Clytomachus to the test. The Theban then stepped aside and addresses the crowd, asking them, and I quote, "Did they think he himself was not doing his best? Were they not aware that Clytomachus was now fighting for the glory of Greece and Aristonicus for that of King Ptolemy, so the king of Egypt? Would they prefer to see an Egyptian conquer the Greeks and win the Olympian crown, or to hear a Theban and Boeotian proclaimed by the herald as victor in the men's boxing match?" So according to this story, the Alexandrian was considered to be a non-Greek, even though the city was founded by Alexander the Great as a Greek city, probably speaking to the cultural diversity of Alexandria in the Hellenistic period. The crowd, in any case, apparently have no problem giving their support to someone who is considered an other or a non-Greek, as opposed to Greeks. However, this aspect of Aristonicus's ethnic identity is considered a source of conflict for the Theban boxer, who believes he is more deserving of the crowd's attention and the more rightful victor on the basis of his Greek identity. So the influx of athletes from the newly expanded areas of the Greek world, particularly from the East in the Hellenistic period, therefore creates points of tension among Olympic athletes. Here we see clashes in the ethnic identity of what were considered true Greeks, or those from mainland Greece, and other long-established overseas Greek city-states, and those considered as others or non-Greeks. So in other words, those from newly founded Greek city-states as a result of Alexander's conquests. So Olympia was thus becoming a place where cultural tensions resulting from the expanding horizons of the Hellenic world were contested and navigated through the means of athletic competition. So moving briefly into the Roman kind of period of occupation in Greece, in 146 BCE, Greece became part of the Roman Empire following the Battle of Corinth. This brought about significant political, social, and cultural changes for many Greek cities and sanctuaries, and Olympia did not remain unaffected. So Romans, as explicitly non-Greeks, were now participating in the games, which is reflected in the victor lists, and the first Roman to appear is in 72 BCE. And in the imperial period, even the Roman elites were competing in the games, such as the soon-to-be Emperor Tiberius, who entered a successful chariot team in the year 4 BCE, as well as the general Germanicus in 17 CE. So according to some scholars, allowing Romans to participate was simply a political and economic decision by the organizers of the games as a way to kind of keep the Romans happy and to keep Olympia in their favor. Furthermore, at this time, many Olympic victors are coming from the eastern areas of the ancient world, with more victors from the coast of Turkey and further afield, such as Egypt and the Middle East, than ever before, as shown in this chart. So according to the victor lists, those from the eastern ancient world were now the majority rather than those from mainland Greece. So it's safe to say that the geographic and cultural horizons of Olympia and the Olympic Games were now stretched across the ancient world. So to conclude, the Olympics were an event which facilitated the interaction of Greeks versus others throughout their history. The Games began as a largely local affair, though Macedonian interest gradually increased, and these non-Greeks competed in the Games in the 5th century BCE. This brought about a sense of cultural tension between Greeks and non-Greeks, as we saw in the story of Alexander I, who was not allowed to participate until he could prove he was of Greek descent. Alexander the Great's conquests in the East then threw the geographic and cultural horizons of the Olympics towards the East, with more and more Eastern victors coming from these newly established Hellenic lands. As a result of this, we see another account of cultural tension between athletes in the example of the Theban and Alexandrian boxer. Shortly after, Romans, as explicitly non-Greeks, start competing in the games, and Eastern athletes even become the majority. So given that there are no accounts of cultural tension among athletes at this point, we might presume that the Olympics have become the culturally inclusive event that they are today. So Olympia, it seems, had developed alongside major political, social, and cultural shifts in order to stay relevant within the Roman Empire. But in any case, the expanding horizons of the Greek world and the increasing cultural and ethnic diversity of the Olympic athletes made Olympia a site of not only athletic challenge, but also a place that challenged what it meant to be Greek or non-Greek. Thank you very much for listening. And if any of you have any further questions you'd like to ask about the Olympics at all or the site itself, please do email me at the address below. Thank you very much.